Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Adrian Arts Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council, and thank you for joining us for today's event on the road ahead for Colombia. As a reminder, we have Spanish translation for this event. To access that, please use the Zoom toolbar and select the language of your choice at the bottom. First, I'd like to begin by also thanking and also acknowledging Adrian Arst, the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's Board of Directors, and among other things, the founder of the Adrian Arst Latin America Center. Adrian, so great that you could join us today for this incredibly important conversation on the road ahead for Colombia. I am incredibly delighted to welcome Adriana Mejia, the Acting Minister of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, to today's discussion. And I also want to welcome and acknowledge Congressman Ruben Gallego and Congressman Dan Crenshaw, who both serve as congressional members of our US-Colombia task force and are joining us today. Our task force, which is co-chaired by Senators Ben Cardin and Roy Blunt, is a nonpartisan, binational, multi-sectoral group that helps to deepen and broaden US-Colombia economic and diplomatic ties. As all of you know, today marks 3 weeks of mass protests in Colombia, which were triggered by a now withdrawn tax reform bill proposed by the government to help stabilize the country's public debt and fiscal deficit. Protests have evolved, becoming a broad call for improvements in other areas, including health, pension, and education systems. The goal of today's discussion is to broaden understanding of the multidimensional crisis faced by Colombia, to discuss government strategies to address it, and to propose ideas for US-Colombia cooperation at this critical moment. Today's program will begin with a fireside conversation with myself and Acting Minister Mejia. I will then speak with Congressman Gallego, and then turn to my colleague Camila Hernandez, who will moderate a conversation with task force members Andres Cadena and Mooney Jensen, and then I will close the event with a fireside conversation with Representative Crenshaw. Beginning, first off, Acting Minister Mejia, welcome back to the Council. It's wonderful to have you. Last month, you joined us for a private discussion on the humanitarian situation in Arequipa, Colombia. We worked with our partners from the Red Cross to develop strategies moving forward. It's so great to welcome you back. Since last week, you're also responsible for overseeing the broader Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So thank you so much for taking the time at such an important moment. I'd like to discuss your perspectives on how we got here, what has happened, and then also the road ahead. So to begin with the state of affairs, Acting Minister, if you could share with the audience, how did Colombia get to this point? And beyond the proposed tax reform bill, what do you see as the underlying factors that contributed to the widespread and prolonged protests that Colombia has seen?
Thank you, Jason. It's an honor to be here with you today. Thank you very much for the invite. And thank you to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to see you, and obviously my warm greetings to you from Bogota. Well, I would begin by saying that we have to acknowledge there are many social demands that have risen from the impact of the pandemic. Many of them were underlying in Colombian society for over the past decades. We do recognize that Colombia is a country with a very high level of inequality, with huge gaps between rural and urban areas, but also with huge gaps within big cities and urban centers. So we should begin by acknowledging these needs and by acknowledging these social demands that have expressed themselves in very different ways throughout the years. This is not the first time that Colombia is undergoing a very active social protest. We had one at the end of 2019, and the last government, or the last governments, I would say, all have seen very different expressions of social unrest and of social demand. So I think it's important to put this into perspective. The second message that I would like to convey to you is in regards to the expression that you used, Jason, when you called this a multidimensional crisis. Colombia is not undergoing a multidimensional crisis. This is the term we use to address the situation in Venezuela, and we have a very big difference regarding that country that has to do with the legitimacy of the state, the legitimacy of the government, the full functioning of state institutions, the full functioning of the weights and counterweights that characterize democracy. So we are having a very challenging time. We are addressing these social demands, and we are witnessing a very complex situation where violence has been included as part of the cocktail that we are witnessing currently. But we are still with our state institutions fully functioning and addressing the situation. The third message I would like to convey is that the government is fully implicated in trying to solve these demands, working very closely with justice institutions, which, as you know, is an independent branch of power, the Attorney General's office, the Procuraduría General de la Nación, are displaying their full attention to address those situations where the police has used excessively its force to be able to contain the violence that has surged. Unfortunately, we have 15 civilian victims that have been confirmed as victims of homicide in the context of the protests and the manifestations. There are another 11 civilian victims that are being verified as to whether their deaths occurred within the context of the protests. But all of these situations, and the president has been very forceful in addressing this, are subject to independent investigations by the judiciary and will not go unpunished. If we find any police officer or member of state institutions to be responsible for these situations, they will be fully investigated and fully brought to the weight of the law. These violent situations, however, have nothing to do with the legitimate social demands that are being listened to through a variety of avenues. We have a table in place for representatives of the government to talk to the leaders or representatives of what is called the National Strike Committee. We have regional tables, and we have a huge display of tables where the director of the Instituto Colombiano de Bienestar Familiar and the presidential counselor for youth are addressing the youth's demands. So we are in very many different places of the country, in all regions, sitting here in Bogota with the National Strike Committee, listening to demands, trying to find solutions, fully open to hear all the proposals, and fully open also to make every fiscal effort necessary to address these demands and be able to find agreements. I would stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Acting Minister. Incredibly important points. If you could elaborate a little bit more on as you mentioned, these are the protests we've seen for a number of years, these demands, and you were mentioning 2019 in the protests, and the fact that these are some of these challenges are not new challenges that Colombia is facing. If you could dive a little bit deeper into that point, into kind of the historical nature in which these protests have continued to emerge, and additional steps that the government is thinking to address those demands.
Inequality is a factor, and I here would quote the president of the Cali Chamber of Commerce, whom we met last Friday when we traveled to Cali with a group of congressmen and a group of ambassadors to listen to the different demands in the city. As you know, Cali has been somewhat of an epicenter of the protests and also of the violence and blockades on roads in the last few days. Esteban Piedradita, the president of the Cali Chamber of Commerce, when he gave his remarks, said, you can see the glass half full or the glass half empty. Colombia is a country that has grown at an average of 4% for over the last 100 years. It's the only country in the region with only one negative GDP growth before the year of the pandemic. It is the only country that has not had hyperinflation. It is the only country that has never ceased to pay its external debt. So these are indicators of a very consistent progress that has brought many people out of poverty and into the middle class, especially in the last 20 years, where the state has made many, many efforts to be able to provide social subsidies and conditioned cash transfers for over the past 15 years, but where we still have very high levels of poverty and, I insist, very big gaps. It's essential to human nature that we all want to progress and we all want to have better living conditions and better welfare. And it is legitimate to bring these demands before the state and to see how we can find an adequate environment where we can be more equitable and redistribute richness better.
Acting Minister, you mentioned at the outset some of the steps that the government is taking to address some of the acts of violence, as well as some of the acts of the police, which have gained a lot of attention internationally. And I'd like to give you a moment to address that in this platform. Several international organizations have, of course, in the international media, we've seen condemning Colombia's police forces for human rights abuses in the past few weeks. We've seen criminal acts, we've seen the vandalism, we've seen blockades by protesters as well at the same time, as well as President Duque's announcement with regard to those blockades just recently. I'd like to give you an opportunity to further delve into the steps that the government is taking to address police violence, as well as the violent acts that are being seen by protesters.
It is our constitutional duty, Jason, to protect fundamental rights of all citizens in our territory. This includes, of course, those who go out on the street and protest, and they have their fundamental right to free expression and to manifestation in the public area. But we also have to protect those citizens who need to be able to mobilize, to transit through the roads, to have access to goods and services, to have access to medicine, and to have access to food. The blockades have, unfortunately, resulted in a lot of hundreds of thousands of tons of food to be inaccessible to the main cities in the country, especially in the south of the country, but also affecting cities like Bogota. There has been a scarcity of gas and of gasoline for the cars to be able to move from one place to the other. The airport of Cali was shut down for approximately 3 days because of the roads that were also blocked. So even if we are open to dialogue, even if the government is fully willing to be able to find agreements with the protesters, the violence, the blockades are impeding the exercise of fundamental rights for the bulk of citizens, and we need to be able to surpass those blockades or take them out of the road and bring to justice also those who are responsible for attacks on critical infrastructure, for attacks on the police themselves, and for attacks on our public transportation systems in the cities.
Acting Minister, I'd like to also, you're on an international platform here, serving as Acting Minister of Foreign Affairs. What's your overall message to the international community as the international community is watching what is unfolding in Colombia and especially to the United States? Of course, Colombia is, I always say, one of our strongest, most important allies, not just in Latin America and the Caribbean, but across the world. What are the important takeaways that you'd like for those watching to hear from the global perspective?
My main message would be that we are undergoing a very difficult challenge, but that this is not the end of the world. That it is being addressed within the rule of law by a legitimate government within a very respectable democracy in the context of Latin America. We have had challenges before and we have overcome them. We will also overcome this one. It is very important that the full complexity of the situation be understood. There are social demands that are legitimate and the government is fully open to address them. There have been reproachable, condemnable situations on the part of the public force that will be investigated and brought to justice. But there is also a political component, and there are also influences from actors that are interested in destabilizing Colombia and especially looking towards the elections next year. So all of these components must be looked at in a very comprehensive way. This simple situation, it's a very sophisticated situation, but we are confident that our institutions and working closely with our partners, we will be able to overcome it and go back more resilient and strong as always.
Thank you so much. And one final question for you. There has been a number of conversations with President Duque with members of different sectors of society, youth, indigenous peoples, the National Strike Committee. What have been the main outcomes of those dialogues, and how do you see that progressing?
There are very important announcements that have been made. One of the first announcements was that the government is going to establish higher education gratuity for those in estratos 1, 2, and 3, which are the poor and well, not the middle class, but the poor people in society. There was another announcement made yesterday regarding a subsidy that is going to be provided to those enterprises that hire youth. It's a subsidy that corresponds to more or less 25% of the minimum wage in Colombia. And we hope this is going to cover approximately 500,000 young people. The progress in the table of conversations with the National Strike Committee is still not very accelerated because we're still in a phase where we are speaking about guarantees in order to continue the social protests while the conversations take place. So that is being negotiated, but the government has been firm and has been sitting at the table and will not stand until we find agreements. And a variety of agreements have also been made with ethnic groups, especially in the south of the country, one of which, and this is a breaking news, is that we are going to open our southern borders today because this was a claim from the indigenous communities in the Department of Nariño. So all our borders with Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil will be open as of today. So a variety of agreements are being put in place, and we will continue. This is we're in this for the long run.
Well, Acting Minister Mejia, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Look forward to next opportunity to welcome you back to the Atlantic Council. Look forward to doing so in person at some point in the near future. And please continue to count on the support of Atlantic Council, our US-Colombia Task Force for strengthening US-Colombia ties. Thank you so much for joining us today.
We highly value and appreciate it. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to welcome Representative Ruben Gallego of Arizona. Representative Gallego, a Marine Corps combat veteran, was first elected to Congress in 2014 with committee assignments, including the Armed Services Committee. Congressman, it's a real honor to have you as a longtime member of our US-Colombia Task Force, and also wonderful to have you with us this morning. I'd like to start off and ask you, Congressman, as the only Colombian American elected to Congress, what is your perspective on what's happening in Colombia? And frankly, with so much going on today, why should this be an issue that the people of the United States should care so deeply about?
Well, from a personal perspective, talking to my family that lives in Colombia, and also my family that left Colombia, they're having basically PTSD flashbacks to the 70s and 80s right now, to something that they felt that Colombia had moved on from, right? And I think a lot of us, at least from the U.S. perspective, had always thought Colombia also had moved on from that too. I understand that there was, underlying poverty that had slowly been edged away. We knew that the GDP of Colombia was growing. We knew that there's a growing middle class, and it was slowly evolving into, I think, a very modern, what is a modern country, don't get me wrong, but a very strong country that's going to have a burgeoning middle class. But a lot of us that have been Colombia, I'd say Colombia files, understood that there was always this kind of underlying tension that had been existing for many years, right? So you have your indigenous problems in terms of feeling that community feeling that they've been left out of the growth in Colombia. Sections of the country that have also just seen no growth and no wealth growth whatsoever, while other parts of Colombia seem to have moved forward. And then just the underlying tension with whether the state should be the predominant sovereign over the people. And there's a lot of, I would say, kind of narco organizations that would love nothing more than to see the state weaken to the point where they have power again. So what happened, I think, in my opinion, is that there was a legitimate protest against government action, and the government reacted by pulling back the legislation. They heard the street, they answered to the street, but now this is involved to the point where it's not just talking about the trying to deal with a situation of poverty and injustice. Now there are, I would say, interlocutors that are using this opportunity to really undermine the state. So that's a very dangerous situation. And why does it matter to Americans? Well, it matters to Americans because Colombia is our best Latin American partner in the Western Hemisphere, and as close to Canada, I would say, as possible. And we literally share like military intelligence with Canada. And I have argued that Colombia should be just as good as the Five Eyes, but that's a different topic we have another time. They have been a stabilizer in the region. If it wasn't for them, I don't know what would have happened to the 2.6 million Venezuelan refugees. They have been an ally to us in terms of helping train other militaries and other police forces that we just don't have the cultural aptitude to do it. And they're a true model for South America about what liberal democracies can do and can continue to do. So it is important. And I think it's important that we find ways to support Colombia in this point. Now, it doesn't mean that we ignore everything that happened. It doesn't mean that we don't ignore the abuses, but much like we don't ignore our own abuses in this country. But we do need to have a stable Colombia in order for us to have a stable Western Hemisphere.
Excellent points, Congressman. And this is part of the idea behind our US-Colombia task force, that the relationship between the US and Colombia is so much more extensive than just the US and Colombia. It's pivotal for the broader region overall. Congressman, going back to your point on the US supporting Colombia, from your perspective, how can the United States support this Colombia, are such a critical ally at this moment in which Colombia is in the midst of these protests?
Well, I've spoken to, I think it was about a week ago, we had an emergency meeting of the Colombian Atlantic Council task force. And so right after that, I spoke to the White House and I asked specifically for, I think it was like 5 million vaccines for Colombia. And there was a new announcement that came out yesterday. Hopefully, Colombia is going to be part of that mixture of, I think it was 60 million doses that they're going to release abroad. I have another follow-up call with one of the vaccine coordinators of that program, and I'm going to also advocate for Colombia, obviously, to get however much I can get, right? And the reason I think that matters is because, again, we need to reinforce that the state can bring is not just there to bring you safety, but also brings you the welfare that the state can also bring, right? And there's no denying that COVID has caused a lot of these problems, right? Especially in Cali, which has a very informal economy, have many people that were absolutely just waylaid by, they already were in poverty, and then were totally waylaid by, COVID for almost a year. If we can have the United States government give the vaccines to the Colombian government, and then they actually show that they are here, they care. I think it's a better way for us to bring down the tensions. Secondly, I think it's important in terms of just state to state show of support for people to understand that yes, the United States is here backing Colombia. We may have our differences. I certainly had some differences with certain members of that Congress and Senate that got involved in the U.S. politics last year, but we are putting that aside because we care about the relationship. We care about the stability and sovereignty of Colombia, just again. A visit, a high-level visit, high delegation visit, I think would be extremely helpful. And then lastly, it's not just Colombia, but I actually do believe that we should have an overall Western Hemisphere COVID relief plan, something that is akin to what we've seen here in the United States, but I think it would go a very long way to help our stabilize liberal democracies in the Western Hemisphere. It would deal with a lot of the refugee flows that are happening that affect us here in the United States. And also in terms of how we do trying to stop the influence of China in Latin America, this would be actually a very good opportunity to do that. And again, what happens in Colombia can easily happen in any other Latin American country. And we don't want that fire to start rolling through all the way down to Tierra del Fuego.
Congressman, incredibly important points. Especially drawing the parallel between the U.S. helping to provide vaccines to Colombia and what that can do insofar as alleviating some of the, at least some of the acute challenges that are being faced by Colombians. I couldn't agree with you more. From the Atlantic Council, we've been continuing with our campaign on the importance of vaccines to Latin America and the Caribbean. These are our closest partners. These are our neighbors. And for our neighborhood to be healthy and safe, we need to help with vaccine to the region. Maybe one last question for you from congressional perspective, in addition to things that you are personally doing. How else do you see Congress and the House being supportive of Colombia at this time?
Well, I think first, we have to get over, there is a movement, I talked about this before, there are some people that are kind of trying to equate what's happening in Israel and Palestine, what's happening in Colombia, totally different things, right? And also I think because of what's happening in Israel and Palestine, it's one of the reasons why the United States isn't as focused on Colombia. And I think that's typical of us, that we always look away, look away from Latin America for anything that happens anywhere else. And that's a bigger, broader problem that we have. The first thing we have to do is we have to explain to Congress, because you have members of Congress, I think, that have always had a kind of a critical eye to the Colombian American relationship. And they're using this opportunity to try to drive that wedge deeper. Now, these are, good members of Congress, but, have been the types that have been very critical of Plan Colombia. Maybe they're critical of the Duque government for being more conservative, whatever it is, but they're using this opportunity to drive that wedge, right? They want to make our support of Colombia based on certain conditions, which as I try to explain some, we already have a lot of those conditions. So the most important thing is, trying to first stop those members of Congress and educate them and make them recognize that, look, Colombia is going through a tough time right now. We need to support them. They are holding themselves accountable. Where we see they're not holding themselves accountable, then yes, we could step in. But the idea that we are first going to set conditions and then help them, it might be too late. We don't want to get to the point where the government of Colombia is going to be so weakened that it's functionally not there. Now, I don't think you're ever going to have a failed state situation like we thought would happen in the 1990s. But again, we want a strong, prosperous Colombia. So that being said, first we say in the military, I think I just saw Dan get on. First, you stop the bleeding, right? That's the first thing we got to do. So we got to stop the bleeding, change the narrative of what's happening in Colombia. And then in terms of just support, number one, as I said, vaccines, getting humanitarian support in terms of vaccines, I think is a really important thing that we as members of Congress can advocate for. Hopefully we don't have to get a letter together and push the White House to do that. I think I got that solved, but if not, then we'll do that. Number two, I do think there needs to be, again, a larger regional, COVID support for Latin America. And I think once that is something that's going to have to happen in the future. I think a lot of us want to focus on infrastructure right now, but I certainly think that you're going to see a movement on that. And again, I think it's a stabilizer for the region, ends up being beneficial to us. And in the end, I think in the long term, it actually will save the United States a lot of money if we can take care of things now instead of letting something fester for longer times.
Well, Congressman Gallego, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your all you do for the US-Colombia relationship, for your and for your longstanding membership as part of our US-Colombia task force. Look forward to continuing to work with you, and so great to hear of the conversations that you've had since our meeting just last week. We'll have a conversation a little bit with Congressman Crenshaw, but first I'd like to turn to my colleague Camila Hernandez, who manages our Colombia work. Thank you so much, Congressman. She will moderate a conversation with two Colombia task force members, Mooney Jensen and Andres Cadena.
Thank you, Jason. And it is my pleasure to welcome Mooney and Andres today. Mooney is Senior Advisor at Albert Stonebridge Group, and Andres is Senior Partner at McKinsey & Company. They're both members of our US-Colombia Task Force. Welcome.
Thank you.
Andres, I would like to start by asking you, we've been speaking about the tax reform bill that triggered the protests. Why was this tax reform bill important? And do you think Colombia will need one in the future?
Well, thank you very much, Camila. I'd like to start just by remembering something that it's beyond Colombia. And it is that there is an ask in the world to revamp the social contract, probably all across the Western nations. It goes from the US to Colombia to the rest of Latin America and many other countries. And COVID-19 increased this ask as it amplified the social differences in health, in education, in housing, and especially in employment sources and income. We saw through the COVID crisis how the different people in our nations suffered the crisis much differently. The ones with access to internet, the ones with housing suffered much less than the families that had not access and had their kids not being able to go to school, or the ones that were living the parents, the grandparents, and the kids under the same housing. And as a result, you saw the structural damage of COVID in a much worse part of the population. So that is a reality, and it's a reality in the US, it's a reality in Colombia, it's a reality across the world. So how the government acted against that? Basically, the government displayed a humongous effort over the past year to cover almost 20 million Colombians through conditional cash transfer programs and be able to avoid a situation that could happen when you have this disparity of societies, and it was starvation. And the country did not have any type of starvation. And the whole logistic process in the country was able to be uplifted to cover for the needs of the people. But we have a structural economy, structurally informal economy. And this does not help. As a result, we reach 40% of our population under the poverty line. This is basically a loss of 10 years of development in Colombia. We got a fiscal deficit because all this cost a lot of money of around 8% in 2020, and an overall debt that was close to 65% of our GDP. So the next step, after doing this humongous effort to uplift the population, 20 million Colombians, and not let COVID really create a disastrous situation like in India and some other countries, was to introduce a fast economic recovery to counteract the short-term trend that COVID-19 created in Colombia, while continue providing the social welfare and the subsidies until the employment was reestablished. But you have to remember that we have 51% of informality in our employment structure. So the fiscal reform was aimed to cover for this. It was basically to cover for providing and lifting the Colombian population while we recovered the economy and the investment came and the confidence in Colombia regained, and we were able to go and just revamp in a V-shape as many other countries. So we need a reform. Of course, we need it, and we need a reform that allows us to finance our fast recovery. But perhaps the main question is not whether we need a tax reform, but what type of tax reform, given the circumstances that we live today. And I would say that what we need is something that is really feasible. Yes, we need a tax reform that increase public income in order to cover the social welfare. Yes, we need a tax reform that is more progressive and more efficient in distributing wealth. Yes, we need a tax reform that in normal conditions would allow us to redefine the playing field. But under the current political and social conditions, especially after the past weeks, my own point of view is that we need a time of an MVP reform, minimum viable product type of reform at this moment, that make us more competitive and is thought not only as a social welfare reform, but also a reform that allows for the recovery of the economy fast and that create confidence, especially not only across the board, but on the Colombian investors, the Colombian businessmen that need to invest back and create those opportunities. And that simplifies tax collection. So the answer, the quite fast answer is yes, we need a reform. It has to be a very well thought reform, and it has to balance the needs for recovery investment in Colombia and the need to continue providing subsidies and welfare in the short term while we recover that investment and job creation.
Thank you, Andres. And you did mention some of the inequalities and the poverty that was exacerbated due to COVID-19. As the Vice Minister and the Acting Minister mentioned earlier today, there's a lot of social grievances. And I would now like to turn it to Muni, who is originally from Cali, and Cali has been the city that became the epicenter of the protests in Colombia. So I would like to ask you, Muni, what is your assessment of the situation in Cali and how has it changed in the past few weeks?
Thank you, Camila, and thank you, Jason, Adrian, and the Atlantic Council for putting this together. It's really important to hear all this diversity of voices. Minister and Congressman, your presence here is really a reassurance and a very bipartisan reason for optimism in very difficult times. So I've been in DC for 16 years, and most of the 16 years I've been able to tell the story of Colombia as a story of recovery and progress. And sadly, the recent situation makes me tell a different story. And although I agree with the minister's reminder that we are a very strong, stable democracy, that we will prevail, this is a very difficult time, and it's important that people in the US and internationally understand it fully. The situation in Cali is the same situation as the rest of the country, except perhaps worse. We've already heard about the impact about the discontent, about the police response, about the negotiations that have not really flourished as much. But I want to focus on the impact that these long days, it's incredible how it seems like an eternity and it's only been a couple of weeks, but how the impact of violence, of destruction, of the roadblocks, of the vandalism is really affecting civil society in an unprecedented way. And Cali has become a sad, and you mentioned epicenter, and it's a very concerning case study. And we've already talked about the reasons why Cali is more vulnerable. They're demographic, they're geographic, they're historical. But the truth is the workers are those who are most affected at this point. It seems like lost in the shuffle was the original reason for the protest, and it has now devolved into something that needs to be heard from every angle. What is happening now? The Port of Buenaventura is closed. The chief of police resigned due to threats last night. The mayor of Cali's entire cabinet will be replaced. Despite attempts at talks, the roadblocks continue. COVID vaccination has all but stopped. According to the Cali Chamber of Commerce, 89,000 vaccines were not applied during the first 10 days of the violent uprising. So that's a lot of people who are more vulnerable, and billions of pesos of focus in this long conversation on an issue that has been underreported, which is the impact of this situation on business activity, on the livelihoods of workers, moms, students, employees, small business owners who depend on their jobs. We've heard about the blockages of medicine, food, and fuel, but there's also blockages of people from going to work, from coming home from work, and from making a living. And that's causing a very quick backslide of the region, of the city, in what was already a complicated set of circumstances from the pandemic on poverty and inequality. So May is proving to be a very difficult month. 40% are only working at partially, and only 11% of productive activity in Cali is at full capacity. And this has hurt mostly manufacturing sector, which is where it's a labor-intensive work. I mean, a bunch of workers. So the main problem for the employees is lack of mobility. 86.5%, these are Chamber of Commerce numbers that were also quoted by Minister Mejia, is lack of mobility. 76% is lack of transportation, of course, because it's destroyed. 67% insecurity on roads. We're talking about the urban center. This is not in the rural parts of the region. And 53% insecurity in their workplaces and around the workplaces. So people are under siege and trying to just get to work. So the indicators are dropping of sales, of employment, as blockages and vandalism increase. So this has a long-term impact. 27% of companies have indicated they would reduce or shut down their operations. This is very concerning. It's a third of the workforce. And 11, this is a very sad number, percent of small enterprises are considering closing. They're already vulnerable. Now they're probably just going to shut down. This leads to, as political sciences know very well, political vulnerability and increased lawlessness. And I think that puts the region, which is already a hotspot of COVID, and it's a difficult region, and we've been following it for many years as it has recovered. It puts it in a difficult situation, and I do believe that story of the workers is something that needs to be told. It needs to be told in the U.S. It needs to be told internationally, because it's kind of being lost in the conversation about some of the other salient issues that have come up in the past. I do think that's to wrap it up is the other human rights story that needs to be told.
Thank you, Muni. And we are actually going to get to that point later in the conversation, but I do want to give Andres a space to talk about the economic implications of the protests. According to government figures, about $1.6 billion have been lost in the past weeks. What are the long-term implications of the situation in terms of economics, Andres?
Camila, there are two ways of looking at this. One is the short term and the second one is the long term. And I know for a fact that given what it had to spend last year on COVID and given the economic impact that COVID had on the Colombian society and Colombian economy, the plans for this year for the government of President Duque and for the whole economy was to shoot for a big revamp. That was the plan. And during the first quarter of this year, we grew at 1.1%. And that was kind of remarkable because you have to put the situation into context. We were still suffering severe lockdowns in many sectors and many large cities. So half of the economy was still not active, especially in the largest cities, especially in Bogota. And the vaccines were coming slowly. So the possibility of activating that was even more challenging. But despite that, the country started to recover, and it grew at 1.1% and was expected to grow faster. But that achievement is highly at risk today. As you say, according to the recent figures for the Ministry of Finance, the country is losing 0.5 billion pesos every day of the strike. And as of yesterday, the overall tally was close to 10 billion pesos. That is around $3 billion, which seems small compared with a country like the US, but put it into context, that's 18% of our national investment in 2021. Almost 20% lost in 3 weeks of the ability to invest nationally in the country when we need more investment. Naturally, we can expect to have a stubborn unemployment rate, if not a spike in the next couple of months. And that comes because our reality, 60% of employment in Colombia is connected only with 4 sectors, 2 of which have been extremely impacted by the strike. Those sectors are commerce, is the government, including health, is manufacturing, and is professional services. And then the 5th one is agribusiness. 3 out of those, commerce, manufacturing, and agribusiness, are being affected directly by the strikes. If the strikes are short, we will have hit and we will recover. If the strikes continue, then, as Moni was saying, we risk losing those employments for the midterm at least. And then the recovery and the whole plan and the whole effort that the country has done is being lost. That is what is really important at this moment. That is why in the short term, we need to get to a consensus and move on. Now, looking at the bigger picture, the long-term implication is also quite simple. We need to create opportunities faster. We have to recover employment. And there's no way to do it unless we increase our investment and our consumption at a scale. There's no country that has been able to do it without investment and without consumption. And if we want to remain a democratic capital society, avoiding becoming a state capitalism society, we need to recover the investment confidence, starting by the Colombians itself and moving along with FDI, who needs to understand what is true and what is not true of the news that they are listening and hearing about Colombia, or what has been told, and come back with confidence to the great business platform that Colombia offers.
Thank you, Andres. And going back to what Muni was saying about the stories of workings that have been lost, the stories of regular civilians, I do want to ask both of you, how do you think the international media coverage has been accurate in covering the situation in Colombia, and also where is it lacking? And finally, to close the conversation, I would also would love your perspectives on how the US can support Colombia. We heard a bit from Congressman Ruben Gallego and also the acting minister. So I would welcome your ideas as well as members of our task force.
Moni, if you want, I can give a first cut on the question on news and let you complement. I do believe, and I'm going to use fact-based analysis here. I just went through a very interesting conversation with Accenture, another consulting firm that had been studying deeply the situation of news and fact-based news management on this crisis. And I got three main conclusions out of that conversation. The first one is that there is an orchestrated propaganda on social media. 1,000 people that had been identified tweeting among themselves 100 times create a social network information bubble that it becomes so big because it just people talking about themselves that it becomes a trend on a specific situation of the strikes. And once they reach a tipping point, then the national and regional media outlets in Colombia pick those trends and make them 30 times stronger. And that way, something that is artificially created as a news become a national news and a trend that goes beyond the borders of Colombia. And that has been manufactured. And it's important to know the evidence behind that. The second point is that violence has been fueled into the strike by the same type of bodegas that manufacture information. Of course, the social turmoil is real. Of course, as we were discussing before, all the needs in Colombia to improve the social contract are real. But you can see evidence in social media of tasks delivered to a small group of activists, infiltrated by violent groups, to crunch against police and create a situation that they can use to fuel the bad image of Colombia. And then there's a third fact to me, and it's that police is not as prepared to act against this as it used to be. And there are very, very good reasons for that. If you see over the past 3 to 4 years, there have been 65,000 less policemen on the streets than we had before in Colombia. Many of the most important intelligence units have been dismantled as well. And that creates less professionalism from the government forces and probably more violence than expected and that needed on the reaction from government to maneuver on this situation. And those three have been very well explained.
Thank you, Andres. I just want to be mindful of the time because we're going to have a follow-up conversation with Congressman Crenshaw. So,
sure.
Muni, to close the conversation, why don't you tell us specific steps that the U.S. can take to support Colombia, a critical ally in the region at this difficult moment?
Absolutely. And I want to say one thing about the media really quickly. I think the media should know better. Andres has given us some very good numbers, very good data that obviously is obvious to us who are not experts, and we just see it in the press. And I think it's fair to denounce excessive force, but I do think that the story is not being told properly, and that nobody is equipped to respond to something like this. And I think specifically events like this, if they had a broader audience or more frequency, would be able to be the kind of the place where the real story comes out. I think the international community has heard one side, the side of the protesters and the human rights activists, and the other side, the government defending itself, but has not heard the other story, which is the story of the rest of Colombia, who is not in this discussion and who is really at an economic and social standstill. Regarding the US, this is a very easy answer, and congressmen know this. You don't abandon your allies. The stakes are very high, and they're too high to let Colombia slip back into being a failed state. That's not a possibility now, but a lot of Colombia's recovery, and we've been very honest about it, has been made through a bipartisan, bilateral effort. It has a name, Plan Colombia. It has an instrument, the US-Colombia trade agreement. And these decades of bipartisan relationships cannot be discarded. And I won't even get into the impact for the rest of Latin America and how many people would celebrate this divorce. But this is not the time. Two governments need to air out whatever grievances they have and questions they have in private briefings and in bilateral conversations, and set a united front where the private sectors and the governments of both countries join forces to rebuild and recover. There is absolutely no other way.
Thank you.
Muriel, let me just add 3 words, Camila.
Andres, okay, 3 words, because we have to go on to Congressman.
Vaccines.
Okay, vaccine.
Restore confidence by helping us lead the narrative and help us recover the economy, accelerated the social infrastructure plans. Those 3 things would change the situation in Colombia.
Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jason Marczak, who will moderate a fireside conversation with Congressman Dan Crenshaw.
Thank you, Camila, and thanks, Mooney and Andres. It's now my pleasure to welcome Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Texas. Representative Crenshaw is a retired Navy SEAL, first elected to Congress in 2018 with committee assignments, including the Energy and Commerce Committee. Congressman, it's a real honor to have you as a new member of our US-Colombia task force, and wonderful to have you with us this morning. I know how important Colombia is to you personally. You went to high school in Bogota. You know the country very well. And I'd like to start off by asking, with your professional and personal knowledge of Colombia, what is your perspective on the situation that Colombia is facing today in light of weeks of protests? And also, as I asked Representative Gallego, why should this be a matter of importance to the American people?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. Pleasure to be a part of this task force. Couldn't help but chuckle a little bit the last comments. I mean, you guys also have a problem with the dishonest media? Politics. So look, that's always going to be a problem, right? And the spread of misinformation and the spread of narratives. I mean, geez, only 1,000 people tweeting mean things about you. That's kids' games, guys. You should see what I deal with. But that is a problem. In all seriousness, I don't mean to make fun of it, but that is a serious problem. And the more that our government can set the record straight with some moral authority, I think is certainly important. Let me back up a little bit. I've been close to Colombia since 1998. All right, that's when my family moved to Bogota, and I started my freshman year of high school at CNG. Started playing soccer there. I was the only gringo. I was pretty much the only American in my entire high school at the time, at least the only one who was there for all 4 years. I mean, 1 or 2 others came throughout the time. That's changed a lot now. I went back for my 15-year high school reunion a few years ago, and it was remarkably different as far as the mix of students. Why am I saying that? The reason I'm telling you that is because in 1998, and the height of the Civil War with the FARC and many other guerrilla groups, you couldn't do much. It wasn't very safe. Our family thought we were crazy. My dad was crazy for moving us down there. Maybe he was. But it was a very different country. Plan Colombia was in its infancy. You couldn't drive outside Bogota. right? If my family wanted to visit Cali or Medellin, couldn't do it. You had to fly there, and for whatever reason, we never flew there. I wish we had. I did get to travel quite a bit. I don't want to make it sound like I never left Bogota. I was on the soccer team, so we got to play soccer tournaments all over the country. But it was dangerous. One day, our car was full of bullet holes, and so we had to get a new one. Some of my most favorite places that we used to hang out in were bombed by the FARC. So I know very well the progress that has been made. And the reason, again, when I looked back at CNG, when I went back for my 15-year reunion, it was full of expats. It was a true international school. It was never really an international school when I was there. There was foreign teachers that were there. It was an English-speaking school. It was not an international school. Okay, I went to a Colombian high school. It became an international school later. Why? Because foreigners were actually coming in. Okay, nobody was afraid of Colombia anymore, and tourism was taking off. The places I always hung out in, your typical places, in La Zona Rosa and El Andino, and all these places, totally different when I'm coming back 15 years later. And so I've been watching closely. They even built a new Andrés right there in the middle of Bogota. Now we all know that's the tourist one. You can't go there. If you really want to go to the real one, you have to go to Chia. Everybody knows that. The tourists go to that one. Okay, just for everybody listening. Now, that we can't lose that progress. Plan Colombia is an amazing foreign policy success story, and we should recognize it as such. Now, look, life happens, and well, some of us certainly did anticipate Venezuela cratering under a socialist regime, and it did happen. I wish we could have done more. I'm not sure what we can do from here on out. We should talk about that to insulate Colombia from that fallout and to deal with the massive population influx. We need to talk about not just coordination with our State Department, but Department of Commerce. Right? I've heard a lot about investment in this conversation and pro-growth policies. That's exactly the right way to be talking about this. And look, this is our hemisphere, this is our neighborhood, and we need to be focused on it. I've rambled on for a little bit. Let me let you get to a couple other questions.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd love to get your perspective. As we've discussed, Colombia's, and as you've highlighted as well, Colombia is one of the U.S.'s strongest, closest global allies. And given these ties, and from your perspective, what do you think? You were just mentioning commerce and trade and investment, but how else can the U.S. Be supportive of Colombia at this critical moment?
Well, in a task force like this, I'm in listening mode also, and you asked that question was asked of our experts who are focusing on this all the time. So their input is essential on that question. We got to look at what works, and we tend to want to just throw money at problems. And sometimes that might be the right solution. I do believe rarely it is. I didn't necessarily hear that suggestion either. Vaccines, of course, throughout the world, frankly, as we get our own population vaccinated, and we're going to have an excess capacity. And how we deliver that, whether we simply sell it on loan, is a suggestion I heard at the last task force. Yeah. Look, I think also in Colombia has. This is something that has come up when we talk about Central America a little bit more, because they're so far behind where Colombia is at. But digitizing the economy, allowing people access to the gig economy. I know Colombians have that to a much larger extent, but can it be better, and especially amongst the poor, when you give people access to additional broadband and therefore the gig economy, and allow them to make money. I mean, again, you're talking about pro-growth policies. That's a huge one. Again, increased relationships with our Department of Commerce, not just our Department of State. I'm not saying anything bad about Department of State, not trying to, just saying Department of Commerce might be a better relationship to foster in so many cases. We need to be talking about things like energy justice. I hear a lot about environmental justice. Keep in mind, the reason I was in Colombia at all is because my dad was in the oil and gas industry. Whatever you think of the oil and gas industry, the reality is that, especially for less developed countries, that's how poor people become less poor, 100% of the time. And we have to be talking about that too as well. So look, I think there's a lot of space for this. It's mostly a cultural shift, I think, in American foreign policy. We've been focused on the Middle East for a very long time. And, you know, I encourage my colleagues all the time, you got to look south of our border more and into Central America, Mexico, and South America. We have a huge interest in a far more developed and prosperous Western Hemisphere. To compete with the Chinese, who do not share our cultural values at all. The Russians do not share our cultural values at all. And I think we need to recognize that forcefully. And, you know, in our Western Hemisphere, we do share a common, I think, a set of cultural values that I think
common Western values that we share across the hemisphere, the person-to-person linkages, the trade linkages, the commercial linkages, investment linkages, it just goes on. And so as we're thinking about why the U.S. should prioritize Colombia and why the U.S. The protests that we're seeing right now are maybe a wake-up call for the U.S. on the importance of that continuing engagement with Colombia. This is, I think, a great opportunity to focus on what that engagement could look like, even deeper engagement moving forward.
Yeah, and I'm realizing that I keep answering your next question every time you ask one, so I apologize for that. Look, as far as prioritizing, yes, we're facing a lot of different problems around the world and internally in the United States. And so the question is, how much focus is really going to be put on that, on this situation, and that's up to this administration. I would also say, look, we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. And I hope we can do this. Yeah. It should be a priority for some of the reasons we stated earlier. Colombia has been an amazing policy success story and an amazing ally. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Again, cultural similarities, for instance, and I mean that specifically with Colombia, and I think more so than a lot of other countries in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah. So this is also administration where the President Biden has traveled extensively to the region. You know, as Vice President, knows the region and understands, I think, the importance of Colombia and the U.S.-Colombia relationship. It's in these protests, the time that Colombia is facing right now is this opportunity to further look at how to strengthen, deepen that relationship moving forward into the next phase, to be supportive of Colombia at this critical moment. Congressman Crenshaw, I want to thank you. It's a pleasure to work with you. I want to thank you for being a part of our task force and for all of your work in support of the U.S.-Colombia relationship. Thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. To those watching, thanks for tuning in. The situation in Colombia, it's important to have a balanced perspective on all the different factors at play to look at the road ahead. And I think importantly, how the U.S. can support our longstanding ally at this critical moment. From the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, we will continue to advance this incredibly important relationship through our U.S.-Colombia task force and through other efforts. So thank you, Congressman Crenshaw. Thank you, Acting Minister Mejia, Congressman Gallego, Mooney Jensen, Andres Cadena, Camilo Hernandez for being a part of today's discussion today.